48 hours after the Black Sea incident, the world still believed it had been an accident. A routine freedom of navigation patrol. A radar misinterpretation. A collision of doctrines, not intentions. That was the language used by diplomats, press secretaries, and crisis managers on every major network. Yet beneath the surface of official calm, military commands on both sides of the Atlantic and the Eurasian landmass were already operating under a different assumption. The assumption that the line had been crossed. At 3:14 Greenwich Mean Time, the Russian guided missile cruiser Marshal Ustinov altered course 12 nautical miles south of its declared patrol zone. NATO tracking stations in Romania and Turkey registered the deviation immediately. The maneuver itself was not unprecedented. What followed was, 3 minutes later, the cruiser activated its fire control radar, locking briefly, only 12 seconds, onto the U.S. destroyer USS Porter. The lock was released almost instantly. No missiles were launched. No warnings were transmitted. But the message was unmistakable. In naval doctrine, a radar lock was not an act of war. It was something worse. A question. The Porter responded by launching 2 electronic countermeasure drones and altering speed. Both ships disengaged without further incident. By dawn, the encounter was already being described as resolved. Inside the Pentagon, it was logged under a single line item. Potential hostile intent confirmed. By the evening of the same day, Russian aerospace forces had raised readiness levels across the Western Military District. Fighter regiments in Kaliningrad and Crimea were ordered to disperse. Mobile Iskander missile units left permanent garrisons and moved into forested holding zones under civilian camouflage protocols. Officially, it was an exercise. Unofficially, it was preparation. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany, U.S. European Command received satellite imagery showing the dispersal patterns. Analysts compared them to archived data from Zapad drills and came to an uncomfortable conclusion. This was not a drill configuration. It was a wartime posture, optimized for survivability after a first strike. At 22:40 local time, General Thomas Keane authorized Operation Cold Sentinel. The order was brief. Increase ISR coverage along the eastern flank. Maintain air presence. Avoid provocation. Every officer reading it understood the contradiction. The first real fracture occurred not in the Black Sea, but far to the north. At 5:17 Greenwich Mean Time the next morning, a USRC 135 Rivet Joint Reconnaissance aircraft crossed into international airspace over the Barents Sea, following a corridor flown dozens of times before. Its mission was passive, listening, not challenging. Russian radar stations at Severomorsk detected the aircraft immediately. 2 MiG-31 interceptors were scrambled within 4 minutes. The intercept was aggressive from the start. The Russian pilots closed to within 30 meters, executing high-speed passes designed to intimidate. The American crew reported repeated illumination from targeting radars, something explicitly discouraged by bilateral safety agreements. At 5:41, one MiG executed a barrel roll directly across the rivet joint's nose. Turbulence rocked the larger aircraft. An automated defensive system misinterpreted the maneuver as an imminent collision threat and deployed countermeasures, chaff, and flares. One flare struck the Russian interceptor's left wing. The damage was minor. The consequence was not. The MiG lost control for less than 5 seconds. That was enough. It clipped the air with its tail, entered a flat spin, and disappeared into the Arctic clouds below. No parachute was observed. By 6:10, Russian media was already reporting the downing of a Russian aircraft by reckless American aggression. By 6:30, NATO air patrol zones had doubled in size. By 7 o'clock, the hotline between U.S. European Command and the Russian General Staff went unanswered. Markets reacted faster than governments. Energy futures spiked within minutes. European stock exchanges suspended trading twice before noon. Civil aviation authorities began rerouting transpolar flights southward, citing navigational uncertainty. In Moscow, the Security Council convened in closed session. President Orlov listened as generals presented options that had been theoretical for decades. Limited escalation, demonstrative strikes, strategic messaging through force. In Washington, the National Security Council mirrored the discussion almost word for word. No one used the phrase World War. Everyone thought it. At 14:22 Greenwich Mean Time, U.S. Cyber Command detected coordinated intrusion attempts targeting power grid control systems in Eastern Europe. The attacks were sophisticated, modular, and unmistakably state-backed. Within an hour, rolling blackouts hit parts of Latvia and eastern Poland. NATO invoked Article 4, consultation, not defense. Yet, the first shots of the war were fired without sound. At 1908 Greenwich Mean Time, a Russian submarine operating in the Norwegian Sea launched a cyber-enabled unmanned underwater vehicle toward a major transatlantic communications cable. The drone never surfaced. It didn't need to. At 1947, data throughput between North America and Europe dropped by nearly 30%. Financial systems slowed. Military networks switched to backup satellites. News organizations lost live feeds. The world experienced something new, not darkness, but delay. A hesitation in reality itself. The U.S. Navy responded by deploying 2 additional attack submarines under silent orders. Their mission was not retaliation. It was presence. Presence had become the new language of threat. At 23:59 Greenwich Mean Time, both sides elevated their nuclear forces, not to launch readiness, but to visibility. Russian strategic bombers conducted patrols along NATO airspace borders. American ballistic missile submarines altered patrol patterns, detectable only to those who knew where to look. The message was mutual and grim. We are awake. We are watching. Do not blink. But blink they did. Just after midnight, a Russian air defense unit in Kaliningrad misidentified a high-altitude target over the Baltic Sea. The target was a U.S. Global Hawk drone. Unarmed, autonomous, silent. The unit commander had 7 seconds to decide. He fired. The missile strike was clean. The drone disintegrated at 60,000 feet. Debris fell into international waters. For the first time, there was no ambiguity. An American military asset had been destroyed by Russian fire. At 0:14 Greenwich Mean Time, the Pentagon classified the event as an act of war. The Third World War did not begin with an explosion. It began with a report, a timestamp, and a line of text transmitted across encrypted channels. Authorization pending. Maintain readiness. All theaters. By the morning of the third day, restraint had become a liability. At NATO headquarters in Brussels, situation maps no longer refreshed smoothly. Data lagged by seconds, then minutes. Satellite feeds blinked in and out as space-based sensors were forced into safe modes following suspected laser illumination events over Siberia. The war was no longer confined to airspace and seas. It had expanded vertically, into orbit, and invisibly, into code. At 6:30 Greenwich Mean Time, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe issued a directive that would later be cited as the functional beginning of open hostilities. Rules of engagement updated. Hostile intent no longer requires hostile action. The language was deliberately vague. It was also irreversible. The first coordinated strike occurred in Eastern Europe. At 7:12 Greenwich Mean Time, Russian long-range artillery units positioned in western Belarus fired precision-guided munitions at what intelligence identified as NATO logistics hubs near the Polish border. The targets were rail junctions, fuel depots, and communications relays. No cities were struck. No civilians were officially targeted. Yet within minutes, supply lines feeding NATO's eastern flank began to collapse. Polish air defenses intercepted some of the incoming projectiles. Others landed cleanly. Explosions tore through depots that had taken months to stockpile. Fires burned unchecked as cyberattacks disrupted emergency response networks. Warsaw activated national emergency protocols. At 7:45, NATO aircraft crossed into contested airspace for the first time since the Cold War. The skies over Eastern Europe filled rapidly. F-35s operating out of Germany and Italy established combat air patrols over Poland and Romania. Russian Su-35s and Su-57s responded from Kaliningrad and western Russia. Both sides flew with weapons hot, sensors fully active, fingers metaphorically hovering over triggers. The first missile exchange happened almost by accident. At 8:19 Greenwich Mean Time, a Russian radar operator misclassified an approaching NATO aircraft formation as a strike package rather than an escort. A surface-to-air missile battery near Kaliningrad launched 2 interceptors. One missed. The other found its target. The downed aircraft was a Spanish Eurofighter. The pilot ejected and was recovered hours later, injured but alive. The aircraft burned in the Baltic Sea, its wreckage drifting toward neutral waters. NATO's response was immediate and proportional. At 8:41, U.S. Navy destroyers in the Baltic launched cruise missiles at the Kaliningrad air defense installation responsible for the launch. The strike was precise. Radar arrays were destroyed. The batteries ceased to exist. No announcement followed. None was necessary. As Europe ignited, the cyber front intensified. Russian operators escalated from disruption to destruction. Power grids in parts of eastern Germany experienced cascading failures. Railway signaling systems across Central Europe shut down simultaneously. Hospitals switched to generators. Civilian panic spread faster than any army. In response, U.S. Cyber Command initiated Operation Black Veil. Within hours, Russian financial networks began malfunctioning. ATM systems across major cities went offline. Stock trading in Moscow halted indefinitely. Government databases corrupted silently. Backups compromised before anyone realized they were under attack. Neither side claimed responsibility. Both sides understood. At sea, the conflict expanded southward. The Black Sea, already tense, became lethal. A Russian naval task group enforcing a de facto exclusion zone issued warnings to NATO vessels approaching the western basin. A Romanian frigate, operating under alliance orders, ignored the warning and maintained course. At 11:06 Greenwich Mean Time, the Russian cruiser Admiral Grigorovich launched an anti-ship missile. The missile struck the frigate amidships. The explosion was catastrophic. The ship sank within 12 minutes. Of its crew of 240, fewer than half survived. NATO invoked Article 5 within the hour. The language was historic. An attack against one is an attack against all. The Third World War was no longer undeclared. Russia responded not with words, but with movement. Armored units crossed from western Russia into Belarus in full strength. Not an invasion, an integration. The distinction mattered only on paper. Satellite imagery showed columns stretching for kilometers. Logistics trucks, mobile missile systems, electronic warfare units. Across the border, NATO forces rushed to fortify defensive lines that had existed only in planning documents days earlier. In Washington, the president authorized the deployment of additional forces to Europe, including airborne divisions and strategic bombers. The order was signed knowing full well that many would arrive too late to matter. The speed of modern war had outpaced mobility. The first mass casualty event occurred far from the front lines. At 14:32 Greenwich Mean Time, a coordinated cyber-physical attack struck a major European air traffic control network. Systems failed simultaneously across multiple countries. Dozens of aircraft were forced into emergency landings. Two did not make it. One passenger jet crashed during approach outside Vienna. Another clipped terrain while diverting in poor weather conditions over the Alps. Hundreds of civilians were killed in incidents officially attributed to technical failures. No one believed that explanation. The war had reached the skies civilians depended on. At 1800 hours Greenwich Mean Time, the conflict escalated again, this time beyond Earth. U.S. Space Command detected the launch of a Russian anti-satellite weapon from Plesetsk. Its target was a military communications satellite providing secure links across Europe. The intercept was successful. The satellite shattered into thousands of fragments, spreading debris across multiple orbital paths. Several civilian satellites were forced to maneuver to avoid collision. Some failed. Global positioning accuracy degraded. Navigation systems faltered. The world's dependence on space infrastructure became painfully clear. Within 40 minutes, the United States responded in kind, not with destruction, but with blinding. Ground-based systems temporarily disabled 2 Russian reconnaissance satellites using directed energy. The effect was reversible. The message was not. Space was now a battlefield. As night fell over Europe, the tempo did not slow. Missile strikes continued along the eastern edge of NATO territory. Air defenses fired until barrels overheated. Pilots flew until exhaustion blurred judgment. Commanders made decisions based on partial data and outdated maps. In Moscow, the General Staff warned that conventional escalation was approaching its limits. In Washington, advisors delivered the same warning in different words. The unspoken conclusion hung over both capitals. If the war continued at this pace, only one rung remained on the ladder. Nuclear forces worldwide shifted posture. not to launch, but to readiness so visible it could not be ignored. Submarines moved. Bombers dispersed. Missile crews received sealed orders they were not yet authorized to open. The world stood on the edge of an abyss it had not planned to approach. At 23:58 Greenwich Mean Time, an encrypted transmission crossed multiple command networks simultaneously. It contained no threats, no demands, only a statement of fact. Escalation control failing. Probability of strategic exchange rising. The night passed without nuclear fire. For now, the world entered the nuclear hour without realizing it had done so. There was no siren, no announcement, no singular moment that marked the transition. Only a gradual tightening of procedures, a narrowing of decision windows, and a silence that spread across diplomatic channels once considered untouchable. At 2:17 Greenwich Mean Time, U.S. Strategic Command elevated its forces to DEFCON 2. It was the first time since 1962. The order did not mean launch. It meant proximity, psychological, procedural, mathematical, to the end of restraint. Missile crews were sealed into bunkers. Submarine captains received coded updates confirming target packages had been validated. Strategic bombers taxied to dispersal runways under the cover of darkness, engines idling, crews waiting. In Russia, the response mirrored the move within minutes. Perimeter systems were activated. Early warning radars shifted to wartime sensitivity, increasing detection range while multiplying false positives. The logic was brutal and simple. Better to see ghosts than miss reality. Both sides believed they were signaling control. Both sides were wrong. The trigger was not an attack. It was a malfunction. At 3:41 Greenwich Mean Time, a Russian early warning satellite registered what appeared to be multiple ballistic missile launches from the North Atlantic. The signature matched submarine-based launches. Trajectories suggested targets deep within Russian territory. The data was wrong. A rare alignment of solar radiation, orbital debris, and sensor calibration error had produced a false cascade. The system had failed before. This time, it failed during a war. The alert reached the National Defense Management Center in Moscow within seconds. Protocol demanded escalation to human verification. Radar confirmation was requested. Ground-based systems showed nothing. The discrepancy created a gap, 5 minutes of uncertainty in which doctrine and instinct collided. The Russian duty officer followed procedure and reported the anomaly as unconfirmed. The system continued counting down. For minutes. In Washington, no missiles had been launched. No orders issued. No awareness existed that the world had entered its most dangerous window. At 3:44 Greenwich Mean Time, a second event occurred. In the Arctic, a U.S. Navy attack submarine detected what it believed to be an active sonar ping consistent with a Russian ballistic missile submarine preparing to transmit launch data. The contact was brief, ambiguous, and likely environmental. The submarine commander had standing authorization to respond defensively. He did not fire. Instead, he altered course and reported the contact. The report climbed the chain faster than intended. Within 3 minutes, analysts in Washington began cross-referencing Russian nuclear force movements with the false satellite alert Moscow was still evaluating. Each side saw the other preparing. Each side assumed intent. At 3:47 Greenwich Mean Time, the Russian General Staff elevated its nuclear forces to full readiness. Launch authorization codes were transmitted, not opened, but delivered. Mobile missile units halted movement and assumed firing posture. Submarine crews moved to sealed compartments. Strategic rocket forces entered the final phase before launch. The president of Russia was awakened. He was given 2 assessments. One optimistic, one catastrophic. The difference between them was measured in minutes. The final error came from Europe. At 3:49 Greenwich Mean Time, a NATO missile defense radar in Norway detected high-altitude objects ascending from the Barents Sea. The system classified them as possible missile stages. They were not missiles. They were debris, fragments from the destroyed satellite days earlier, falling into denser atmosphere and burning unevenly. The radar software had never been tested against such a pattern during wartime sensitivity. The alert propagated automatically. Within seconds, NATO systems flagged a possible Russian launch. Washington received the warning at 3:50 Greenwich Mean Time. For the first time, both sides believed, simultaneously, that the other might already be firing. The President of the United States was brought into the Situation Room at 3:52 Greenwich Mean Time. He was told, plainly, that confirmation windows were collapsing, that contradictory data was flooding in, that if a real launch had occurred, response time was already slipping away. He asked one question: do we know for certain? The answer was no. The military recommendation was prepared regardless. In Moscow, the Russian president faced the same question. His advisors were split. Some argued the alerts were too consistent to ignore. Others pointed to the absence of radar confirmation and urged patience. Patience was a luxury measured in seconds. At 3:55 Greenwich Mean Time, the Russian president delayed authorization. 30 seconds, then another 30. Each delay increased the risk of losing retaliatory capability, at least according to doctrine written decades earlier. At 3:57, he made a decision that would never appear in any manual. He ordered to stand down. Not publicly, not formally, quietly. Verification before launch. At 3:58 Greenwich Mean Time, U.S. analysts received updated radar data confirming no inbound missiles. The alert status remained high, but the immediate threat evaporated. At 4:01 Greenwich Mean Time, both sides independently concluded the same truth. There had been no attack. The world had come within minutes of annihilation over noise, debris, and assumptions. The war did not end that night, but something fundamental broke. Within hours, emergency back channels, silent for days, reopened, not to negotiate victory, but survival. Neutral states transmitted messages neither side could ignore. Operations slowed. Air patrols widened their separation. Missile units stood down incrementally, one layer at a time, like fingers easing off a trigger. The conflict burned itself out not through agreement, but exhaustion. Over the following weeks, hostilities declined unevenly. Skirmishes continued. Cyber operations lingered. Space remained contested. But the momentum toward total war stalled. No treaty was signed. No surrender declared. The Third World War ended the way it began, without ceremony, without closure. The aftermath reshaped the world. Global markets took years to recover. Satellite infrastructure was permanently altered. Military doctrines were rewritten around uncertainty rather than dominance. Nations spoke of deterrence with less confidence, and of restraint with more humility. Millions were dead, not from nuclear fire, from cascading failures, infrastructure collapse, limited strikes, and accidents magnified by scale. Historians would later argue whether the world had truly avoided apocalypse or merely postponed it. They would name the conflict many things: the silent war, the systems war, the almost war. But among those who had watched countdown timers reach single digits, it was known by a simpler name: the last warning. And no one could say with certainty whether humanity would listen the next time.